The wind howls across a sea of iron-grey waves. A single raven soars above the water, its cry lost to the roar of the storm. Beneath it, the prow of a longship slices through the foam, its carved dragon head gleaming with rain, its crew silent, faces lit by flashes of lightning. In the distance, land waits, unseen, unknown, untouched. This is where the story begins, a story of courage born in cold and silence, of men and women who carved destiny from frost and fire, of love and loyalty, blood and belief, the fierce beauty of a people who refused to bow to the edge of the world. For 3 centuries, they would rise and fall with the tides, explorers, poets, traders, and warriors, each chasing the same unending whisper. What lies beyond the horizon? Can you imagine it? Standing on a frozen shore at dawn, the salt wind biting your face, the oars creaking, the horizon glowing with promise. Would you have stayed behind or sailed into the unknown? Tell me in the comments, what would call to you most, the sea, the stars, or the story waiting beyond them? And before the journey begins, gently tap like and subscribe so you never miss a single voyage into history's sleeping heart. Now dim your screen, let the night close in, and drift back with me to the whisper of the north wind, where the Viking Age begins. The wind that drifts across the northern seas is old, older than the kingdoms of men, older than the stories told beside the fire. It carries with it the scent of salt and snow, the low moan of waves against rock, and a promise that something beyond the horizon is stirring. It is the 8th century. The world above the 60th parallel lies bound in winter's hush. Across Norway's broken coastlines, mountains plunge into the sea, their peaks glazed with frost. Between them lie narrow valleys where small farms cling to the earth, warmed by flickering hearths. Here, the Norse people endure the long nights. They rise before dawn to tend their animals, mend nets, and whisper quiet blessings to the household spirits who keep watch through the dark. Inside one of these timber halls, the air is thick with wood smoke and the scent of peat. A woman spins wool beside the fire, her spindle whirring softly. Children sleep on furs nearby. From the rafters hang dried fish and herbs, and a carved wooden figure of Odin keeps silent vigil in the corner. Outside, the snow drifts deep, muffling the sound of the sea. These are the quiet roots of the Viking Age, not of endless battle, but of endurance, craftsmanship, and faith. The Norse were farmers, fishers, woodworkers, and poets long before they were ever sailors of legend. Their world was one of balance, between hardship and beauty, storm and stillness, life and death. When the sky cleared after a storm, the horizon shone pale and endless, like a sheet of polished bone. On such mornings, young men would walk down to the shore, their cloaks snapping in the wind. They would watch the waves and wonder what lay beyond, islands perhaps, or entire lands yet unseen. For centuries, their ancestors had told stories of far-off coasts and strange people. The pull of that mystery was like a heartbeat in the sea itself. The north was not an easy home. In summer, the sun barely set, and the air hummed with insects over meadows of wildflowers. But in winter, darkness reigned. Storms swept in from the Atlantic, and the cold gnawed at the wooden walls. To live here was to understand both silence and struggle. Perhaps that is why the Norse learned to listen. to the whisper of wind in the rigging, to the groan of ice, to the stories hidden in the turning stars. Each generation grew up beneath those stars. They learned to read them as others might read a book. The constellations were guides, not just for the night sky, but for the imagination. A boy sitting beside his grandfather could trace the arc of the Big Dipper and be told it was a wagon carrying the gods across the heavens. He would learn the path of the sun on the solstices, the way the light shifted on the fjord cliffs, and how to find his way home by the colour of the clouds. Their stories were not written on paper, but lived in memory and sound. Around the hearth, skalds, the poets of the north, recited sagas of giants and heroes. They spoke of Yggdrasil, the great tree that bound all worlds together, and of the 9 realms that spun from its roots and branches. These tales were not just entertainment, they were maps of meaning. They taught courage, patience, and the belief that even the smallest life was part of something vast and eternal. Sometimes, when the nights were longest, travellers would visit from another fjord, bringing news and rumour. They would speak of merchants who sailed south to trade furs for iron and wine. They would tell of distant kingdoms, the Franks, the Saxons, the men of the Rus. And somewhere in these tales, the first sparks of restlessness caught flame. Can you imagine standing in that narrow valley, watching your breath turn to mist, hearing stories of warmer lands and gold coins stamped with foreign kings? The world must have seemed both immense and close, like a dream just out of reach. In these early centuries, there were no empires in Scandinavia. Only small scattered communities, each led by a chieftain whose strength lay in loyalty and fairness. The people were bound by kinship and custom. Decisions were made at the Thing, a gathering beneath open sky where free men spoke and judged disputes. The law was memorized, recited aloud by those who carried it in their minds. In this way, justice lived in the air, breathed, spoken, remembered. Yet even as they honoured tradition, they were innovators. The Norse crafted ships unlike any the world had seen, vessels that could ride the open ocean yet slip into shallow rivers. They built with patience and intuition, shaping oak planks so perfectly that the hull flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. The keel was their compass, the sea their teacher. At first, these ships carried trade goods, amber, wool, walrus ivory. But in time, they would carry something greater, curiosity. The Norse spirit was not born from greed or conquest, but from the ache to know what lay beyond the known. There were omens too. The northern lights flickered like spirits across the sky, and some said they were the armour of Valkyries shining as they rode to battle. Others believed they were the souls of the dead, dancing above the world of the living. In these lights, the people saw destiny, a sign that the world was wider than their valleys, richer than their fishing grounds. The turning point, though, was not in the heavens, but in the hearts of those who built the first Nars and Drakars. The whisper of the north wind grew stronger, urging them to test the sea. By the late 8th century, small groups of Norse sailors were already exploring the coasts of the Baltic and the North Sea. They learned the tides, the hidden currents, and the rhythm of the waves that could carry them farther than their fathers had ever gone. And so, slowly, a transformation began. In the evenings, while the firelight trembled across the beams, talk turned to shipbuilding. The men spoke of timber and tar, of sails woven from wool thickened with grease to catch the wind. The women mended clothing and prepared dried fish for long journeys. Even the children listened, eyes wide with the thrill of what might come. No one yet called them Vikings. That word would come later, meaning to go on an expedition. But the spirit of voyaging was already stirring. In spring, when the ice melted and rivers roared with meltwater, the first ships slid from their shelters into the fjords. Their hulls gleamed with fresh pitch. The sails billowed like the wings of seabirds. A small crowd gathered on the shore, families, elders, friends, to watch them leave. There was pride, but also fear, for the sea gave and took in equal measure. One by one, the oars dipped into the cold water. The sound of them, steady, rhythmic, alive, echoed against the cliffs. The ships turned toward the horizon, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Perhaps they were only heading to a nearby island, or perhaps, without knowing it, they were stepping into history. Each voyage taught them something new. How to read the wind, how to navigate by the sun, how to trust the sea's strange moods. Back on land, life continued in its slow, patient rhythm. Fields were tilled, mead was brewed, songs were sung. But the idea of travel had taken root. The people began to imagine their place not as the end of the world, but as its beginning. Evenings in the north were long, and the firelight flickered on faces that dreamed of coasts beyond the mist. Some said the gods themselves had planted this longing, that Odin, in his endless search for wisdom, whispered to their hearts through the wind. And so, as the years passed, the boats grew larger, the journeys longer, the stories bolder. From the quiet valleys of Norway and the broad plains of Denmark, from the icy inlets of Sweden, they set forth. What began as whispers became songs, and what began as dreams became voyages. The north wind carried them onward, across seas no one had charted, toward lands no one in their world had seen. But in that first moment, in that first hush of dawn, when the oars touched water and the fjord echoed with their rhythm, they were still only people, farmers, fishers, families, answering the oldest call of all, the desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. The sky was pale with early spring light when the last of the ships slipped away. The watchers on the shore shaded their eyes, listening until the sound of rowing faded into the distance. Then they turned back to their homes, carrying with them a strange feeling, a mix of pride, sorrow, and wonder. In that silence, the north wind sighed once more through the pines, as if blessing the journey. And from that sigh, history began to move. When the ships were gone, silence returned to the valleys. The fjords lay still beneath the morning mist, their waters smooth as dark glass. On the far side of the mountains, spring crept slowly down from the peaks, melting the last snow and filling the streams with icy laughter. Those who had stayed behind, the farmers, the mothers, the elders, turned back to the steady rhythm of life. They were the children of the fjords, born to a land both harsh and generous, where survival meant understanding the heartbeat of the earth. In the villages scattered along the coastlines of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the year began not with a date, but with the thaw. Men broke the frozen ground with wooden ploughs tipped with iron, guiding oxen across the narrow fields. The soil was thin and stony, yet they coaxed life from it: barley, rye, oats, and hardy vegetables that could endure the cold. Women tended goats and sheep, their wool spun into thread for sails and tunics. The children fetched water from the streams, gathered berries in summer, and learned early how to shape a life from what nature offered. The sea was a second field, wide, living, and unpredictable. Every family had someone who fished, setting out at dawn in small boats, nets coiled like sleeping serpents beside them. Cod, herring, and mackerel fed the people and filled the drying racks that lined the shores. The smell of salt and smoke was the scent of sustenance. Life was not easy, but it was deeply woven together. The long winters, the short summers, the shared labour, all bound the people in a rhythm older than memory. Each season had its rituals. When the first snow fell, the herds were brought close to the homestead, and the long nights began. Fires burned day and night, tales and songs filled the dark. Their world was alive with unseen presences. To the Norse, everything breathed spirit. The mountains, the rivers, the storms. They left small offerings for the landvættir, the land spirits, to keep them at peace. A bowl of milk for the household Nissa who guarded the home. A whispered word to Thor before setting out to sea. In the mornings when frost glimmered on the grass, the old women would step outside, wrap their cloaks tight, and lift their eyes to the sky. They would read the weather not from words or numbers, but from the hue of clouds, the sound of the gulls, the scent of the air. It was an ancient conversation between people and the world around them. Inside the longhouses, warmth gathered like a blessing. These homes were built from timber, turf, and patience. Long, narrow halls with raised hearths in the centre. The smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, darkening the beams until they gleamed like bronze. Along the walls lay benches covered with furs, where families sat close to share meals and stories. At the heart of every home burned the fire, literal and symbolic. Its light meant life. It cooked the food, warmed the bones, and guarded against the unseen forces of the cold. Even in summer, when the air was soft and the meadows were green, a small flame was kept alive, tended with quiet reverence. Their faith was not a single book, but a living world of myth. They believed that Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, held all existence within its branches, gods, men, giants, and spirits. Each root touched a different realm, and every leaf was a life. They honoured Odin, the seeker of wisdom, Thor, the protector, Freya and Freyja, bringers of fertility and love. These gods were close, not distant, flawed, passionate, and as human in spirit as those who worshipped them. In spring, people gathered for blot, the seasonal feasts of offering. Animals were sacrificed, not in cruelty, but in gratitude. The blood was sprinkled on sacred stones, and the meat shared among all. Songs rose into the air, carrying hope for good harvests and calm seas. Children learned these customs as naturally as breathing. From their earliest years, they listened as their elders recited verses and proverbs that carried wisdom across generations. Cattle die, and kinsmen die, but the fame of a good name never dies. Such lines, from the Havamal, the sayings of Odin, were not mere poetry. They were guides to living honourably in a world of uncertainty. The Norse valued strength, but also fairness, courage, but also wisdom. To share food with a stranger was a sacred act. Hospitality was a duty, not a choice, for any traveller could be a god in disguise. Around the hearth, people told stories not only of battles but of kindness, cleverness, and fate. One could imagine a night like many others. Snow thick outside, the aurora shimmering faintly beyond the smoke hole. A skald sits near the fire, his voice low and steady. He tells of a time when Thor rode his chariot across the clouds, sparks flying from the hooves of his goats. The children's eyes are wide, the adults quiet. For a while, the room seems to breathe with the story, the wind, the thunder, the laughter of gods echoing across the worlds. These stories bound them together. They reminded them that life was fragile but meaningful, that bravery and faith could endure even the longest winter. Yet beneath the peace of these evenings, a quiet change was growing. The journeys of the seafarers, those who had vanished beyond the mist, were returning as whispers. Sometimes, months later, a ship would come back with stories of islands rich with grass, or monasteries filled with gold and silver. The men spoke softly of such places, half in awe, half in disbelief. But for now, the daily life of the fjords continued. The children who'd once watched the first ships depart grew up with those stories as lullabies. They learned to shape wood, to weave rope, to repair sails. Skills that would serve them when their own time came. In the warmth of summer, the valleys came alive. Fields shimmered green, bees droned over heather, and the air smelled of pine and salt. Families gathered to celebrate the midsummer blot, lighting bonfires on the hills and dancing as twilight refused to end. It was a season of abundance and laughter, a fleeting brightness before the dark returned. Sometimes, in those quiet summer nights when the sun barely dipped below the horizon, a sense of yearning stirred again. The horizon gleamed faintly gold, and the sea called softly to those who listened. Out there, it seemed to say, the world is wider than you know. And so, from generation to generation, the balance continued between those who stayed to tend the land and those who sailed to seek their fate. Both were needed. The farms fed the voyages brought back stories and trade. Together they formed the pulse of a people both rooted and restless. If you stood then on a high ridge, overlooking the fjord at dusk, you would have seen smoke rising from hearths scattered like tiny stars below. The calls of seabirds echoed through the air. Perhaps you would hear the faint sound of a hammer striking iron, a blacksmith forging a blade, or a farmer mending a plough. Life was humble, yet full of purpose. There was beauty too in the small things, the shimmer of frost on a window, the warmth of bread fresh from the hearth, the laughter of children chasing each other through the grass. These moments were the soul of the North, quiet, enduring, unbroken. But the sea never ceased its whispering. The children of these valleys grew into men and women who would one day answer that call, carrying with them the memory of home, the blessing of their ancestors, and the quiet strength of the land that shaped them. They would remember the smell of the pines after rain, the rhythm of the loom, the hum of bees over clover. They would remember the songs their mothers sang and the tales told beside the hearth. These memories would be their compass when they face the unknown. For now, though, the fjords slept beneath the northern light. The waves lapped gently at the shore. The fields shimmered with dew. The stars returned one by one, their reflections trembling in the still water. Somewhere far away, a ship creaked in the darkness, its sail furled, its crew asleep. But the land itself was dreaming too, dreaming of journeys yet to come. The children of the fjords did not know it yet, but their lives, their patience, their craft, their faith, were the roots from which an entire age would bloom. And so the night deepened, calm and eternal, as if the earth itself paused before history began to move again. The sea has always been a restless thing. Even when it seems still, there is a pulse beneath it, a deep, slow breathing that stirs the hearts of those who live along its edges. When spring returned to the north, melting the snow from the mountain passes and loosening the ice from the fjords, that pulse could be felt in the villages like a quiet drumbeat. Nets were mended, sails patched, and hammers rang out across the shores as men shaped new planks of oak beneath the lengthening sun. The air smelled of tar and salt. Children watched as their fathers worked, learning the sacred geometry of the ship's hull. The curve of the keel was drawn from memory, guided not by rulers but by instinct, the inheritance of generations. To carve a boat was to carve a dream, something meant not just to float, but to live upon the water. The Norse believed the sea was a realm between worlds. To master it was to understand both courage and humility. Each board fitted into place carried meaning, each nail and rivet a prayer to the gods who ruled the waves. When the hull was done, the prow was shaped, and here, art met reverence. Dragon heads were carved to guard the ship from spirits of the deep. Some snarled with open jaws, others curved gracefully, their scales etched with runes. To the people of the fjords, these were not ornaments but companions, protectors that carried the soul of the vessel. As the first true fleets took shape, something new stirred in the air, a mingling of pride and wonder. The people gathered to watch the launchings, to see the ships touch the water for the first time. The wind rippled through the sails like breath through lungs, and those who stood on shore felt, without yet understanding, that history had shifted. The year was close to 793, though no one marked it in books or calendars. Time was measured by seasons, by tides, by the stories the skalds would later tell. Across the sea to the west lay islands, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and beyond them the green hills of Britain. Fishermen spoke of monasteries there, of soft-spoken monks and glittering treasures kept for their god. But the Norse did not yet sail for gold. They sailed because the wind whispered to them, because the sea seemed to beckon, and because their hearts, hardened by cold and silence, yearned for discovery. Still, word spread of easy plunder and undefended shores. And so, one summer morning, a handful of ships left Norway's rugged coast, their sails square and pale against the dawn. The sea opened before them like a path of liquid glass. The voyage was perilous. The North Sea was no gentle teacher. Its moods could shift in moments, calm skies turning to roaring gales, waves rising high as mountains. But the Norse were patient sailors. They trusted the stars, the sun's arc, and the flight of birds. They read the shape of waves and the colour of the water to find land long before it appeared. When at last they reached the rocky isles beyond Scotland, they found small monasteries perched above the cliffs, stone walls, simple chapels, gardens of herbs. The monks there lived quiet lives of prayer and labour, their days marked by bells rather than tides. The meeting of these two worlds was sudden, bewildering, and, for those who recorded it later, terrible. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would write of it in awe. On the 6th day before the Ides of January, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. But for the Norse who came ashore, it was not the desecration of faith. It was the discovery of a new reality. Gold and silver gleamed in the candlelight, and the walls held carvings unlike any they had seen. These treasures seemed to belong to a world of wonder, a world their gods had never warned them of. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 marked, to later historians, the beginning of the Viking Age. Yet to those who lived it, it was simply the first crossing of a boundary between isolation and expansion, between the old world and the unknown. When the ships returned home, their sails heavy with treasure and stories, the people gathered to hear of what they had seen. The skalds listened carefully. They turned those tales into song, and those songs carried across the fjords like the call of distant birds. There were many emotions among the listeners: astonishment, pride, even fear. Some whispered that the gods had guided the voyage. Others wondered if the monks' strange god would bring curses upon them. But all agreed on one thing: the sea had opened a door. Through that door, the Norse would step again and again. At first in small groups, then in fleets that would touch every shore from the Black Sea to Newfoundland. Yet in those early years the voyages were not always raids. Many were peaceful journeys, trade missions, explorations, or simply visits to kin who had settled abroad. The Norse carried furs, amber, and iron tools. They brought back wine, silver, and silks. In this way, the northern world began to weave itself into the wider fabric of Europe. Back home, life continued its steady rhythm, but something intangible had changed. Young men gazed longer at the horizon. Children carved tiny ships from driftwood. Women spun stronger sails, dyed red or brown to catch the wind. A new generation was growing, one that saw the sea not as a barrier but as a road. The longships, with their shallow keels and flexible hulls, could skim across deep oceans or glide up narrow rivers. They were perfect instruments of mobility, a marriage of art and necessity. With these, the Norse could travel faster and farther than any of their neighbours. They learned the patterns of the tides around Britain, the fogs of the North Sea, and the currents that led south toward the Frankish coast. They established camps on small islands where they could repair ships and rest. Step by step, the known world widened. The sea became a teacher of unity as well as ambition. Men from different fjords, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, began to meet and trade knowledge. In the harbours, the sound of hammers and voices mingled. Old rivalries softened beneath shared adventure. The spirit of a greater north began to form, though no one yet named it so. At night, when the fires burned low and the stars wheeled above, sailors would lie on the decks and tell stories to each other. Of whales breaching near the prow, of sea fogs that glowed faintly green, of birds that circled endlessly, leading them toward land. They would sing the old songs of home, their voices carried by the wind over the dark water. There is a quiet beauty in imagining that moment. The creak of wood, the slap of waves, the shimmer of frost on the ropes. A world suspended between sky and sea, between past and future. The dragon ships were more than vessels. They were symbols of transformation. They carried not just warriors and goods, but ideas. Each voyage brought back new words, new customs, new faiths. Slowly, through trade and travel, the Norse world expanded its sense of itself. In the settlements of the British Isles, local people learned Norse words. In the north, monks' writings found their way into sagas. Cultures blended in ways neither could have foreseen. And through it all, the ship remained the heart of it, a thing of power and grace, gliding silently through the mist. In later centuries, poets would look back on those early voyages with awe, calling the ships sea steeds and wave runners. They would remember the courage it took to leave the safety of the fjords, to trust one's fate to the shifting moods of the ocean. For those who built them, the dragon ships were a bridge between worlds, between gods and men, land and sea, life and legend. If you stood then on a high cliff overlooking the North Sea, you might have seen one gliding far below, its striped sail glowing red in the sunset, its oars flashing like wings. The air would have smelled of salt and pine resin, and the cry of gulls would have mingled with the faint rhythm of song rising from the deck. Each voyage began with courage and ended with story. Each wave carried the memory of those who dared to dream beyond the horizon. And so, as the 9th century dawned, the North awoke, not with thunder, but with the whisper of sails catching wind. The dragon ships had opened their eyes. The world would never again be the same. The news came first as whispers, strange tales carried by merchants and travellers, drifting across the coasts of England and France like sea fog. They spoke of men from the north, tall and fair, with shields like the sun and ships that glided faster than the wind. Some called them Northmen, others heathens, and others still spoke their name with awe and dread. Vikings. But for many who heard the first reports, the stories seemed impossible. How could anyone cross such wild seas and strike without warning? And yet, by the summer of 793, there was no denying it. The monastery at Lindisfarne had fallen. The sacred island, once a beacon of learning and prayer, lay silent, but for the cry of gulls and the sighing of the waves. In the chronicles of the monks, the event was written with trembling hands. Immense whirlwinds and lightning preceded the Great Terror, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These were signs of the calamity that was to come. To them, it was as if the end of days had brushed the edge of the world. But to the Norse, far across the sea, the story was already becoming legend. When the raiders returned home, they brought not only gold and silver, but stories of vast lands, soft-spoken priests, and treasures beyond imagining. The skalds turned these tales into song, and the songs became wind, carrying word from village to village, fjord to fjord. Around the hearths of the north, men listened, their eyes reflecting firelight and ambition. The sea that had once been a boundary now looked like a road paved in opportunity. The children who had watched their fathers carve ships began to dream of voyages of their own. And so, more sails were raised. The raids that followed were not born purely of greed. The Norse were not yet a single people, but many small communities, each bound by loyalty to a chieftain. Competition for land and honour was fierce, and the promise of adventure was irresistible. Europe, meanwhile, was unprepared. The kingdoms of the Carolingians and the Anglo-Saxons were rich but scattered, their coasts undefended. Monasteries, centres of wealth and knowledge, stood as easy targets, their bells tolling softly over lonely shores. But to understand this moment, one must see beyond the clash of faiths. The monks of Lindisfarne had seen horror, their sacred books torn, their altars broken, and they wrote of it in anguish. Yet they could not know the fear and fascination mirrored in the hearts of those who had come. The Norse did not yet grasp the power of the faith they were challenging, nor the vastness of the world they were stepping into. For a time, the raids continued like the changing of the seasons, sudden, sharp, and fleeting. A handful of ships would appear from the fog, strike swiftly, and vanish again into the waves. The rhythm of the sea became the rhythm of uncertainty. To the people of England and Francia, it was as if the ocean itself had come alive, breathing men and fire, then falling silent once more. In the north, these journeys brought transformation. The spoils of the raids flowed back into the fjords, silver crosses, coins from far kingdoms, silks from foreign markets. These treasures were not hoarded, but reshaped. Silver melted into brooches, crosses turned into pendants marked with runes. The old and new worlds began to intertwine, even as they clashed. The stories of these encounters spread far and wide. The sagas that would later be told in Iceland began here, in these first voyages, not yet written, but living on the tongues of sailors and poets. Can you imagine it? A longhouse at night, the fire glowing low, the wind moaning through the cracks. A sailor just returned from across the sea tells of a land where bells ring through the mist, where men kneel before one God, and where gold gleams on every altar. The listeners lean closer, their faces half lit, half shadowed, wonder and unease mingling in their eyes. Even as the raids grew bolder, so too did curiosity. Some began to trade rather than plunder, finding in the southern lands both profit and peace. Ports along the English and Frankish coasts became meeting places where Norse merchants and local traders exchanged goods and wary glances. Out of these brief exchanges, the first fragile bridges were built. Of commerce, of language, of curiosity. In time, the Norse came to understand that wealth could be gained not only by the sword, but by the hand extended across the table. Amber, iron, and furs flowed south. Fine cloth, wine, and silver flowed north. The North Sea became a living corridor, connecting worlds that had once been strangers. Yet, even as trade blossomed, the raids continued. For the hunger for adventure was not easily stilled. The young and bold saw glory in the risks and fame in the songs that followed. Still, behind every raid lay the heartbeat of home. The men who sailed returned to their farms in winter, bringing stories and goods to their families. The women who had kept the households running listened with quiet pride, and sometimes quiet fear. They knew that each voyage could be the last. The sea was generous, but never safe. Many ships never came back. Their names lived on only in rune stones, those upright stones carved with runes of remembrance, set beside the paths so travellers would read and remember. Somewhere in Denmark or Norway, you might picture such a stone, its surface rough beneath the fingers, its words simple yet eternal. Haldan raised this stone in memory of Eirik, his brother, who sailed west and did not return. These stones were the first pages of Viking history, carved not on parchment, but in the earth itself. To the south, the world was changing too. Kings began to take notice. Charlemagne, mighty ruler of the Franks, ordered watchtowers built along his coasts. Yet even his empire, vast and disciplined, could not guard every inlet. The Norse ships slipped through the gaps like shadows on the water. The raids had begun as sparks, but soon they would spread like fire, not just in violence, but in influence. Wherever the dragon ships touched, they left traces, a word, a custom, a story. In England, towns began to whisper Norse names. In Ireland, small Norse settlements appeared along the rivers. In time, these would grow into great cities, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, born from both sword and trade. But all of that was still to come. For now, The echoes of Lindisfarne still drifted through Europe like the sound of a distant bell, warning and calling all at once. Back in the north, winter returned, laying frost over the fields and silence over the sea. The longhouses filled once more with smoke and song. The skalds told of brave men who crossed the storm, of fortunes won and lost. The children listened, eyes wide, their dreams shaped by the rhythm of the waves. And beyond the hearthlight, in the cold, starlit night, the dragon ships waited, their prows gleaming faintly with frost, their sails furled like sleeping wings. The raids had begun, but so had something far greater, a movement of people, of ideas, of destinies. The world was opening, and no one could yet see how far it would reach. The sea was no longer a border, it was a beginning. The wind that once carried whispers of adventure now carried the sound of ambition. Across the fjords of Norway, the islands of Denmark, and the forests of Sweden, the Viking world was stirring. What had begun as isolated voyages, small groups seeking trade or plunder, was slowly becoming something far greater. The sea, once a restless boundary, had become a kingdom all its own. For centuries, the people of the north had lived in scattered communities, bound by loyalty to local chieftains. Each valley, each fjord, each island had its own leader, a jarl, chosen not by divine right, but by respect. A jarl was a man of wisdom and courage, one who could settle disputes, lead raids, and ensure the survival of his people. But as the wealth of the Voyages grew, so too did the power of those who commanded them. The jarls who could muster fleets became more than local leaders. They became sea kings, rulers whose authority was carried not on land, but by wind and tide. Their power was fluid, like the sea itself. They claimed not borders, but harbours, not fields, but routes. A true sea king ruled wherever his ships could reach. The first of these kings rose in Norway. Among them was a man remembered in half-light and legend, Harald Fairhair, who would one day be called the first king of a united Norway. But before his time, there were others, Gudrud the Hunter, Halfdan the Black, men whose tales drifted between myth and history. In Denmark, the sea kings were bolder still. The Danish coasts, low and fertile, gave rise to strong fleets and rich harbours. From here sailed the ships that struck deep into Frankish lands, following the rivers like silver roads. Their sails filled with southern winds, and their holds filled with wealth, not only from plunder, but from trade and tribute. These early kings learned to blend force with diplomacy. When they could not conquer, they bargained. When they could not rule, they married. The sagas tell of alliances sealed over feasts, where oaths were sworn in mead and silver, and the future of nations was decided in the flicker of torchlight. The Viking world was no longer a wilderness of scattered farms. It was becoming a network, a living web of settlements, trade routes, and loyalties stretching from the icy north to the warm coasts of Francia and beyond. At the heart of this transformation were the ships, those living vessels of oak and will. The longships, sleek and swift, were the chariots of destiny. Each one carried not just warriors, but the weight of a people's identity. Imagine standing on a cliff above a Norwegian fjord in the 9th century. Below you lies a harbour crowded with ships, their hulls gleaming with pitch, their dragon heads rising into the morning mist. Men load barrels of fish, bundles of cloth, and jars of honey. Blacksmiths hammer weapons to a steady rhythm. Children run along the shore, shouting as gulls wheel overhead. The air smells of salt and pine, smoke and iron, the scent of an age being forged. The north was still wild, but its people were learning to shape that wildness into power. And beyond their shores, the world was watching. In the courts of England, kings spoke of the heathen army, fleets of dragon ships that had begun to land not just for raids, but for conquest. The Norse no longer struck and vanished. They stayed. They built winter camps, fortresses of earth and timber. They brought families, craftsmen, traders. They claimed land. In the year 865, the great heathen army landed on English soil. A vast coalition of Norse and Danish warriors led by legendary figures, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubbe, sons, it was said, of the great Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar truly lived or was a tapestry of older tales, his name burned like a star in the northern sky. The campaigns that followed were long and harsh, but they changed the face of England. Kingdoms fell, treaties were made, new towns were founded. The Danelaw, the region of England ruled by Norse law, emerged as a living blend of cultures. Back in Scandinavia, the tales of these conquests returned like waves. Skalds sang of cities captured, kings ransomed, fortunes won. The sea kings listened, and their dreams grew larger. In the halls of Denmark, feasts lasted for days. The flickering firelight shone on golden cups, polished arm rings, and shields painted with sigils of power. The poets recited verses that honoured the fallen and praised the living. Bright burns the fame of the Sea King's sons. Their oars beat the blood-red tide. The raven feeds, the dragon flies, and glory walks beside. But even as the songs grew grander, the reality of life in the north remained humble. Beyond the feasting halls, the farms still stood, their thatched roofs bowed beneath the snow, their fields lying quiet beneath the stars. The women tended the hearths, the elders taught the young, and the same rhythm of work and prayer continued as it had for generations. The difference now was one of spirit. The people no longer saw themselves as small or isolated. Their world had expanded. Letters from foreign kings arrived, sealed in wax. Merchants returned with silks from Byzantium, spices from the East, coins stamped with strange faces. The sagas began to mention not just gods, but emperors. The Sea Kings ruled this new age with both sword and ship. Their thrones were often carved from driftwood, their crowns made of iron rather than gold. Yet their reach was vast, farther than any northern ruler had ever dreamed. Norway's coasts teemed with shipyards. In Denmark, great harbours like Hedeby and Ribe thrived as centres of trade, alive with languages and laughter from every corner of the known world. Swedish merchants sailed eastward, following the great rivers of Russia, reaching as far as Constantinople. Everywhere the Norse went, they left traces, in the words of languages, in the shapes of towns, in the bones of ships buried beneath the earth. But power, like the tide, always shifts. As the Sea Kings rose, so too did the conflicts among them. Alliances broke, rivalries flared, and blood was spilled not only on foreign shores, but in the fjords themselves. The North, for all its glory, was still a place of honour and vengeance, where the balance of fate could turn with the throw of a spear. Still, amid the storms of ambition, there were moments of peace, scenes of breathtaking calm that would linger in memory. A harbour at dusk, where ships rest with their sails furled and the water glows gold with the setting sun. Fishermen mending nets on the pier, children chasing each other through the shallows, the hum of voices mingling with the lowing of cattle from the hills. Even in the Age of Kings, the heart of the North beat in such moments, small, human, and enduring. And far away, across the sea, new lands awaited: Ireland, Scotland, Normandy, where Norsemen would build towns, marry locals, and blend their bloodlines into the story of Europe itself. The Sea Kings had turned movement into mastery. They ruled not only through conquest, but through adaptation. Wherever they went, they learned new faiths, new crafts, new ways of rule. And yet, in their hearts, they carried the same music that had begun it all: the rhythm of oars in water, the whisper of wind against the sail. By the end of the 9th century, the North had entered its golden age, fierce, fertile, and far-reaching. Its people had transformed from scattered tribes into a civilization of explorers, poets, traders, and rulers. But every golden age casts a long shadow. As kings grew stronger and kingdoms took shape, the freedom of the old ways began to fade. The thing, once the gathering of equals, became the tool of rulers. Old gods gave way to new faiths. The sea that had once been a frontier became a road of empires. And still, at night, when the wind rose and the stars shimmered over the water, an old voice could be heard. The same whisper that had called to the first voyagers: "Go farther." The age of sea kings was only the beginning. The world would grow wider still, and the Norse spirit would carry it to the edge of the known world. The sea was restless again. It shimmered like a sheet of hammered silver beneath the low northern sun, its surface calm in one breath and wild in the next. Along the coasts of Norway and Denmark, the harbours stirred with movement once more. The creak of timbers, the smell of tar and pine, the rhythmic clang of hammers shaping iron nails. Spring had returned, and with it came the urge to set sail. The sea kings of the north had begun to look west, toward the shadowed lands beyond the horizon, where fog rolled thick and green hills rose from the sea like sleeping beasts. They had heard tales from fishermen and traders of islands rich with grass, of rivers that shone like mirrors, and of towns that welcomed ships with open markets rather than swords. And so the sails were raised again. One by one, the dragon ships slid into the fjords, their oars dipping in unison. The air was filled with the scent of salt and spring rain, and the shouts of farewell echoed between the mountains. The people on the shore watched until the sails vanished into mist, proud, afraid, and silent. To sail west from Norway or Denmark was to follow the path of uncertainty. The North Sea was fickle, and the weather could turn in an instant. Storms rolled down like living creatures, wind howling through the rigging, rain striking the decks like needles. Yet the Norse knew its moods. They read the colour of the sky, the flight of seabirds, and the feel of the wind on their skin. Sometimes the fog would clear, and land would rise ahead, cliffs sharp as axes, green slopes descending into sheltered bays. These were the islands that would come to know the sound of Norse footsteps: Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, each one a stepping stone between the homeland and the wider Atlantic. The first arrivals did not always come with swords drawn. Many were traders or settlers seeking new fields, new pastures, and a gentler climate. The Norse brought their families, their livestock, their gods, and their memories. They built homes of turf and timber, not unlike the ones they had left behind, their smoke rising into unfamiliar skies. On the Orkneys, Norse settlers found deep, fjord-like inlets and rolling meadows perfect for grazing. On the Isle of Man, they raised small wooden halls beside rivers where salmon ran thick. The locals, Celts and Picts, sometimes fought, sometimes traded, and sometimes intermarried. Over time, the blood of the North and the Isles mingled, and a new culture began to take shape. Part Norse, part Gaelic, and wholly of the sea. The soundscape of these new worlds was rich and strange. The gulls still cried, the waves still sighed against rock, but there were new voices too. The notes of Celtic harps drifting through the air, mingling with the deep chant of Norse song. On misty evenings when the fires burned low and the sea glowed with moonlight, one might hear both tongues speaking across the shore, not in war, but in wonder. The Norse who settled here learned from the people they met. They took local wives, learned local crafts, and shaped their longhouses from stone rather than wood. The Gaelic tongue borrowed Norse words for ships and trade, while Norse speech took on the lilting rhythm of the Western Isles. Yet the sea never ceased to call them onward. Beyond these islands lay larger lands, Ireland, green and divided into rival kingdoms. Scotland, wild with mountains and lochs. To the Norse, they were lands of both opportunity and mystery. Their coasts were dotted with monasteries, their rivers rich with fish, their shores lined with trade routes waiting to be found or conquered. The first Norse landings in Ireland were swift and brutal, remembered in local chronicles as the coming of the foreigners. Towns were raided, treasures taken, and monasteries burned. But as years passed, the pattern changed. The raiders stayed. By the early 9th century, Norse settlements began to take root along Ireland's coast. What started as small encampments grew into fortified harbours, places like Dublin, the Black Pool, which would one day become Dublin. In these places, trade and transformation flourished. Ships from Scandinavia, Ireland, England, and the Frankish lands met in busy markets. Silver from the east, glass from the south, wool and hides from the north, all passed through Norse hands. The Norsemen who settled there became something new. Not just raiders or farmers, but merchants and city builders. They brought their sense of order to the wild coasts, laying out streets and markets, digging harbours deep enough for their longships. In time, the Irish began to call them the Ostmen, men from the east. The Norse, in turn, adopted many of the customs of their new homes. They wore local garments, spoke both tongues, and baptized their children in Christian churches even as they whispered prayers to Thor at sea. It was an age of mingling, of conflict, yes, but also of creation. Out of storm and struggle came cities that would endure for 1,000 years. And still, the western winds beckoned. The Norse of the Isles looked farther, to the vast ocean beyond. Some spoke of lands seen only in dreams, places where the sea turned pale with fog and the sun lingered at midnight. Others said they had glimpsed great icebergs and heard the cries of unknown birds. They built sturdier ships, nars, broader and deeper than the warships, meant for carrying families, livestock, and goods across long distances. The art of navigation deepened. Sailors learned to follow the path of the sun, the direction of whales, the taste of salt in the air. From these western isles, a new generation of voyagers would one day rise, men like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. But their time was still far ahead. For now, the Norse world was focused on its newfound western kingdoms. The north had become a web of connections. Norway linked to Orkney, Orkney to Ireland, Ireland to the Isle of Man, the Isle of Man to Scotland, ships carried not only goods but songs, stories, and kin. A wedding in Dublin might bring together families from 3 seas away. A merchant's child might speak 3 languages before he could even write his name. On calm evenings, when the tide was low, the harbours glowed with light. Fishermen mended their nets, while traders stacked barrels of ale and wine. From the longhouses came the scent of roasted fish and peat smoke. And somewhere, a skald sang softly of the home they had left behind, of snow, of pine, of the north wind's whisper. But for all the warmth of settlement, the Norse spirit remained restless. Their hearts beat to the rhythm of the waves. They were a people of motion, forever caught between the desire to belong and the need to wander. And the sea, ever patient, kept its secrets. In the nights of the Western Isles, when clouds parted and the moon cast a silver path across the water, one could almost imagine the gods of the old country watching from afar. Odin with his single eye, Njord with his calm seas, ran with her nets of fate. Perhaps they smiled to see their children thrive in strange lands. The sails on the Western Sea had brought the Norse into a new world, not just of geography, but of identity. They were no longer merely raiders of the North, but citizens of a broader world. Their bloodlines, their languages, their beliefs had begun to blend with those they once called foreign. And as they looked to the horizon, they must have known, even without words, that their journeys were not yet done. Because beyond Ireland and Scotland, beyond the Isles and the mist, the ocean still whispered promises of lands yet unseen. And the Vikings, children of the wind, were never ones to ignore a whisper. The wind of the Western Sea carried more than mist. It carried the scent of promise. By the end of the 9th century, the Norse world had stretched across oceans and coasts, its sails now common sights in ports from Dublin to the Dnieper. Yet for some, even that was not enough. There were men and women who longed for freedom, for space, for a place where the reach of kings and the weight of feuds could no longer find them. And so they turned their eyes toward the farthest edge of the map, a place spoken of only in rumours. It began with a man named Floki Vilgedarson, remembered in sagas as Hrafna Floki, Floki of the Ravens. The story tells that Floki had heard of a distant land beyond the Shetlands and the Faroes, a place where fishermen had once drifted by accident and seen mountains rising out of fog. He gathered his family, his livestock, and his ravens, for ravens, sacred to Odin, were said to know the way to land. When the ships set sail, he released them one by one. The first turned back, the second circled the ship and returned, but the third flew forward and never came back. Floki followed its path and found Iceland. The land was vast and silent, with cliffs black as coal and valleys veined with rivers of glacial melt. Geysers hissed from the ground, and steam drifted across the moss-covered plains. In summer, the light never left. In winter, it never came. To some, it was a harsh and alien place, but to others, it was freedom itself. Word spread slowly. Traders and travellers carried tales of this island to the west, its fresh grass, its empty valleys, its rich fishing waters. By the late 800s, families began to leave Norway to settle there. Some went because of curiosity, others because of law and blood. For this was the time of Harald Fairhair, the first true king of a unified Norway. His rise had brought peace to some, but unrest to many. Those who refused to bow to his rule fled, taking their ships, their kin, and their gods with them. Iceland became their refuge. a new beginning carved out of exile. Imagine those early voyages, ships heavy with livestock, timber, and hope. The sea long and unforgiving. Mothers holding their children as waves slapped the hulls. Fathers watching the horizon with silent determination. Behind them, the familiar fjords faded into mist. Ahead, only the endless grey of the Atlantic. When at last they reached land, they must have stepped ashore in awe. The beaches gleamed black beneath the pale sun. Mountains stood like silent sentinels around them. The air smelled of salt and sulphur, cold and clean. It was a world untouched by men, raw, immense, alive. Here, the settlers built their first homes. They raised turf walls against the wind and kindled fires beneath roofs of driftwood and grass. Sheep and cattle grazed on the summer meadows. Streams ran clear from the glaciers, and birds nested on the cliffs in number beyond counting. Each new family claimed land and named it, marking their place in this new creation. The names remain to this day. Valleys called after those who first built there, mountains after the gods they trusted, rivers after the hopes they carried. And though the land was strange, the rhythm of life soon found its balance. In summer, people fished, hunted, and harvested hay for the long, dark months to come. In autumn, they gathered for feasts, sharing news and stories. In winter, they stayed close to their hearths, listening to the wind howl across the plains, dreaming of home and eternity. The old gods came with them, of course. Thor's hammer was carved into doorposts. Offerings of ale were poured into the earth for the land spirits. Yet there was something different in the air here. Something vast and solemn, as if the gods themselves had stepped back to listen. The settlers said the land had power of its own. Landvetia, spirits of stone and soil, who guarded the island and demanded respect. Before every voyage, sailors lowered their dragon-headed prows as they neared the shore, lest they frighten these beings. Over time, Iceland became not only a refuge, but a realm of its own. Without kings, without castles, it was governed by law and memory. In 930, the Althing was founded, one of the world's first parliaments. Each summer, people from every corner of the island gathered at a place called Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. There, in a great natural amphitheatre carved by shifting earth, they recited the law aloud, settled disputes, and renewed their bonds as a people. The sound of voices rose into the open air, mingling with the cry of ravens and the rush of waterfalls. The law speaker stood upon a rock, his words carrying across the crowd. No parchment was used. Everything was remembered, held in the mind like a sacred song. Here, beneath the wide Icelandic sky, a new society was born, built not on conquest, but on consensus. Iceland became a place of poets and dreamers. The long winters, filled with darkness and stillness, gave birth to sagas, stories that would preserve the memory of their ancestors for centuries. Men and women gathered by lamplight, reciting tales of gods, heroes, and voyages that crossed both sea and time. In those stories, the lines between myth and memory blurred. Odin's ravens flew alongside sailors' dreams. The deeds of settlers became epics, their hardships woven into legend. There was hardship, yes, famine, storms, volcanic eruptions that blotted out the sun, but there was also resilience. The Icelanders learned to live in harmony with their land, respecting its temper and trusting its gifts. Their isolation became strength. Cut off from the mainland, they preserved the old ways long after other Norse lands had turned to new faiths. They spoke the ancient tongue, carved runes into stone, and remembered every name and lineage. Still, the spirit of exploration never slept. From Iceland, the gaze turned farther west again, toward a horizon no one yet knew. There was talk of another island, green and cold, glimpsed by sailors blown off course. One of these men was Gunnbjörn Ulfsson, who sighted what he called the islands in the west. His story would linger for years, half believed, half dreamed. Then came Eric the Red. Exiled from Iceland for blood feud, he sailed west with his family and crew, following the rumours. After many days adrift, he found land, immense, mountainous, and white with ice. He called it Greenland, hoping to entice others to join him. And join they did. By the end of the 10th century, Norse farms dotted Greenland's southern fjords. Goats and sheep grazed where ice met meadow. Churches rose beside turf houses. Life endured even here, on the edge of the frozen world. Imagine those evenings beneath the northern lights. The aurora rippling green across the dark sky, reflecting off snow and sea. Inside, a hearth burned low, and the voices of settlers murmured softly, telling stories of the homeland they would never see again. They were still bound to it, though, by language, by custom, by the sea that linked all things. Ships came and went from Iceland and Norway, carrying news and hope, though fewer each year. For in time, the distances grew longer, the winters harsher. Greenland's isolation deepened until it seemed more dream than place. Yet the memory of those who dared to build there, who turned exile into home, endured. They had pushed the boundary of the known world farther than any before them. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, each journey a step into the unknown, each settlement a testament to the stubborn endurance of the human spirit. And beyond Greenland, sailors spoke of another land, still farther west, one of forests and rivers where grapes grew wild. They called it Vinland. The sagas say Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, reached it around the year 1000. Whether it was Newfoundland, Labrador, or some forgotten shore, no one can say for certain. But the dream was real enough. A dream of a world beyond the edge of maps. The Norse had found not just new lands, but new horizons within themselves. They had carried their stories, their gods, their courage across 1,000 miles of sea and silence. And wherever they went, they built warmth out of wilderness. On quiet nights in Iceland and Greenland, when the wind whispered through the grass and the stars shimmered above the snow, they must have felt both very far from home and deeply connected to it. The same stars shone over Norway's fjords and Iceland's lava fields, over Greenland's ice and Vinland's woods. The sea was the thread that bound them all. It had carried them from their valleys into eternity, not for conquest alone, but for creation. And so the Norse, children of the wind and the tide, became the founders of new worlds. They did not know that their age was already halfway through, or that in the centuries to come their gods would fade and their kingdoms change. For now they only knew the sound of waves breaking on strange shores, and the quiet pride of knowing they had followed the horizon farther than anyone before. The world of the north had changed. The dragon ship still sailed, their sails swelling like the wings of ravens across the sea. But the hearts of their people were turning toward a new horizon, one not of land or conquest, but of faith. The old gods still lingered in the valleys and along the fjords. Their names were carved into door frames and whispered before voyages. Thor guarded the hearth, Freya blessed the fields, Odin watched over wisdom and war. The people poured ale into the earth to thank the Landvettir, the spirits of place, and raised their eyes to the thunder whenever it rolled, believing the hammer still struck above the clouds. But across the sea, another faith had risen, one carried not by sails, but by words and light. From the south, from the courts of Christian kings, came priests and missionaries, their robes fluttering like ravens' wings in the wind. They brought books filled with stories unlike the sagas, of one God who ruled all things, of peace instead of vengeance, of eternal life beyond the grave. At first, the Norse listened with curiosity, sometimes amusement. Their world was full of gods, not one. The idea of worshipping only a single being, unseen, unarmed and merciful, seemed almost fragile. And yet there was something powerful in this new belief. It spoke of forgiveness instead of fate, of compassion instead of glory. It promised that the soul could live on, not in the halls of Valhalla through battle, but in a heaven of peace through faith. In the beginning, the two worlds existed side by side, the hammer and the cross hanging together around the same necks. People prayed to Christ on Sunday and offered mead to Thor on Thursday. They baptized their children in churches built beside groves once sacred to the old gods. The transition was not swift, nor was it violent, not at first. It was slow, like the melting of snow in spring, the blending of two streams into one. The first to embrace the new faith were often the travellers, traders, sailors, and those who had seen foreign lands. They had visited the markets of Francia, the churches of England, the shining city of Constantinople. They had seen the beauty of cathedrals and heard the haunting echo of Latin hymns. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth Gormson was among the first great rulers to convert. The rune stones he raised near Jelling still speak his words. Harald, who won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Yet even for Harald, the path was not simple. Conversion was both faith and politics. To accept Christianity was to open trade with powerful neighbours, to be seen as civilized in the eyes of kings to the south. It was a bridge between worlds, a way to protect the realm while reshaping its soul. In Norway, too, the change began to stir. Missionaries from England and Germany travelled through the valleys, preaching beneath open sky. Some were welcomed, others were driven away. The old beliefs were not easily set aside. To many, abandoning the gods of their ancestors felt like betraying the very land they lived upon. But change came nonetheless. One by one, the chieftains converted, often followed by their people. Baptisms were held beside rivers that had long been holy to the spirits. Crosses were carved into the stones that once bore runes of Odin. Churches rose where once there had been feasting halls, wooden and simple at first, yet filled with quiet light. Still, the old world did not vanish. It lingered in stories and seasons, in the rhythm of festivals. The midsummer fires still burned, though now they were blessed by priests instead of offered to Freya. Yule still marked the deep heart of winter, its evergreen boughs symbolizing life amid darkness, though the songs were sung in new names. The meeting of faiths was not a war of swords, but a conversation of hearts. Imagine a small church on a Norwegian coast, its wooden beams smelling of pine, its candles flickering against rough walls. Outside, the sea sighs as it always has. Inside, a young man kneels, uncertain. Around his neck hangs both a cross and a hammer, one for salvation, one for strength. He does not yet know which he will choose, or if he must. The priest's voice rises softly, and for a moment, the two worlds seem to breathe together. The old and the new, the hammer and the cross, side by side. There were times, of course, when the transition brought conflict. Not everyone accepted peaceably the fading of their gods. In some regions, temples were torn down, idols were burned, blood was spilled. But such moments were rare and brief compared to the quiet endurance of coexistence. Even the sagas themselves, written later by Christian hands, preserve the echoes of both worlds. Odin's wisdom beside Christ's mercy, fate beside faith. The North found a way to carry both without losing itself. In Iceland, the change came through wisdom rather than war. Around the year 1000, the people gathered at the Althing to decide their path. The debate was long and fierce, some refusing to abandon the old gods, others urging unity under the new. At last, the law speaker, Thorgeir Ljósvetningagodi, withdrew to think. He lay beneath a cloak for a day and a night, alone with his thoughts, while the wind whispered through the grass. When he rose, he spoke quietly. If we are to remain one people, we must have one faith. And so it was agreed. Iceland would become Christian, though each man might worship as he wished in secret. It was a compromise born not of conquest, but of care. From that moment on, the cross stood where once the hammer had ruled, yet both remained in memory. Christianity brought more than new prayers. It brought new art, new laws, and a new sense of connection to the wider world. Stone churches replaced wooden temples, their bells echoing across the valleys where once horns had sounded. Monks and priests began to write down the sagas, preserving the very stories of the old gods within the pages of their holy books. And so, in a strange and beautiful twist, it was the faith that replaced the old ways that also saved them from being forgotten. In the quiet of those early churches, one can imagine the blending of voices, a Norse hymn rising with the rhythm of waves, the smoke of incense curling through air still thick with the scent of pine and salt. The candles flicker, and outside, snow falls gently on the graves of those who had once raised their hammers to the sky. The world had changed, but its soul remained the same. The Norse still valued courage, loyalty, and honor. They still believed that life was a journey across uncertain seas. Only now, their compass pointed toward a different light, one that spoke not of destiny, but of redemption. And in this mingling of the old and the new, the North found something rare. A faith shaped not by destruction, but by transformation. The hammer was laid beside the cross. The gods slept, but their stories lived on, carried by the same people who now knelt in prayer, their hearts still beating to the rhythm of the sea. The age of belief had turned a page, and in the stillness of that turning, the North exhaled, its spirit whole, its memory eternal. The sea was not the only path the Norse followed. There were other waters, quieter, winding through forests of birch and pine, glimmering beneath skies of endless dawn. When the dragon ships turned east, their sails reflected not the blue-grey of the North Sea, but the soft green of rivers unending. From the coasts of Sweden, across the Baltic, and deep into the unknown, the Vikings found a new world, not of storm and salt, but of stillness and silver. This was the age of the Varangians, the Eastern Norse, traders, explorers, and wanderers who followed the waterways that linked the Baltic to the Black Sea and beyond. Their ships slipped through lakes and channels like shadows. They traded their oars for poles, dragging their vessels over stretches of land where rivers ran dry, their laughter echoing through the woods. They carried with them furs soft as smoke, iron blades, amber bright as trapped sunlight, and they sought what all merchants sought: wealth, wonder, and stories. And what they found glittered in their eyes and in their sagas: silver. In the markets of the East, in the lands of the Slavs and the Finns, they found coins stamped with the marks of distant empires, Arabic dirhams from far-off Samarkand, bearing inscriptions they could not read, but whose weight they understood. They melted them down, turned them into bracelets and rings, symbols of power and prosperity. These rivers became known as the Eastern Roads of Silver, not drawn on any map, but etched into the memory of the Norse world. The route wound from the Gulf of Finland down the Neva River, through Lake Ladoga, across the Volkhov, and into Lake Ilmen, to the trading settlement of Staraya Ladoga, or Aldegjuborg, as the Norse called it. From there, they followed the rivers farther south, where they met the great waterways of Europe, the Dnieper and the Volga, flowing like arteries toward the heart of civilization. Along these routes, they founded towns that would become cities: Novgorod, meaning new fort, and Kyiv, whose name still carries the echo of ancient footsteps. Here, amid forests and markets, Norse and Slavs mingled. Through trade, marriage, and alliance, they shared goods, language, and dreams. The Norse brought seafaring craft and governance. The Slavs brought the richness of land and culture. Out of their union would rise the first Russian realm, Gardariki, the land of cities. The sagas remember its founders. Rurik, the Norse prince invited, it was said, by the Slavic tribes to bring order to their warring lands. Whether legend or truth, his name would live on, for from his line would come rulers who called themselves Russ, a word born from the Norse word for rowers. The Russ became a bridge between worlds, their ships carrying northern goods to the south and southern treasures back to the north. Along the Dnieper River, they built fortresses and trading posts, where fires burned by night and languages mixed by day. Imagine one of those river camps. The air smells of pine and smoke. Furs are piled in neat bundles, glinting in the torchlight. Men and women move among the stalls: Slavs, Finns, Norse, Greeks, and Arabs. The air hums with many tongues, yet trade speaks its own universal language. Coins clink, laughter rises, the river glows gold beneath the setting sun. And among them move the Norse, tall, pale-haired, their cloaks pinned with silver brooches, their speech a rolling song of the sea. They are far from the fjords of home, yet they walk as if the world itself is one vast shore. Down the rivers they sail, toward the Black Sea and the fabled city of Constantinople, Miklagard, the great city. No Norse tongue could fully capture its splendor. Its walls gleamed with marble. Its domes caught the light of dawn. Its markets overflowed with silk, spices, and gold. Those who arrived there must have felt as though they had stepped into a dream. In the emperor's court, they traded furs for silver, amber for wine, weapons for wisdom. Some stayed, entering the service of the Byzantine ruler himself. These men became known as the Varangian Guard, elite warriors sworn to protect the emperor with their lives. They stood tall in their northern armor, axes shining, eyes like winter seas. To the Byzantines, They were both foreign and faithful, fierce yet loyal, their oaths sealed not by words, but by honour. One chronicler wrote, "They are men from the north, faithful to their lord even unto death." In Constantinople's vast halls, where mosaics glittered like stars and incense curled in the air, the Norse must have felt both wonder and humility. Their gods of thunder and frost seemed far away here, in this city of light and gold. Yet they carried their spirit with them, the courage, the steadiness, the unshakable calm of sailors who have weathered every sea. Some of the Varangians returned home rich, their arms heavy with gold. Others stayed, buried beneath the southern sun. Their stories drifted northward, told in longhouses by firesides, half dream and half truth. To those who listened, Constantinople became more than a place. It became a symbol, the farthest shore, the edge of the world. And yet, for every voyage south, another turned back north, carrying not just silver and silk, but ideas. Through trade and travel, Christianity spread deeper into the Norse lands. Art, writing, and architecture followed in its wake. The East had given the North not only wealth, but wisdom, a sense of its place in a world larger and older than it had ever imagined. Still, the Norse who sailed those rivers never forgot who they were. Even in the markets of Miklagarda, they wore their runes and carved Thor's hammer in secret. In the calm between journeys, they sang songs of the homeland, of cold seas, of loved ones waiting beneath snow-lit skies. Their voices echoed softly across the waters, carried by the same winds that had once guided them from the fjords. In this great network of rivers and roads, the Norse became the thread that wove continents together. Their ships brought the north to the east and the east to the north, mingling silver with song, faith with memory. For centuries, the dirhams they carried would glint in Scandinavian soil, buried with the dead or hidden in fields as treasure hoards, proof of how far their journeys had gone. Even now, archaeologists find those coins, Arabic inscriptions beside runic symbols, distant worlds joined in the earth of the north. Each one is a story of travel, of courage, of connection. By the end of the 10th century, the roots of the Rus had become lifelines of commerce and culture. The Norse were no longer only raiders or settlers. They were diplomats, merchants, explorers, mercenaries, and storytellers. They had touched both the edges of Europe and the heart of the East. And as their ships drifted homeward, the sound of their oars echoed softly, a heartbeat that tied sea to river, dawn to dusk. It is strange and beautiful to imagine that a people born among fjords and storms would find their destiny also in still water and foreign sunlight. They had begun as wanderers seeking land and become the binders of worlds. When night fell over the rivers of the east, the stars reflected in the water as if sky and earth had traded places. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled in the dark forests, and the oars dipped silently in the current. A sailor might lift his gaze and see those same stars he had known since childhood. The same constellations that shone over Norway and Iceland. And in that moment, he would know that no matter how far he had come, he was still beneath the same sky, part of the same great song. The eastern roads of silver had brought the Norse to the edge of empires, and in doing so had carried the voice of the North into the heart of the world. The wind had carried them across oceans and rivers, through storm and song, but every voyage, no matter how far it drifted, always led home. In the stillness after the age of great journeys, the Norse world began to listen again, to the quiet things, to the sound of wood creaking in the hearth, to the drip of melting snow from the eaves, to the scratch of a chisel against stone. This was a time not of conquest, but of memory. The North was changing. The gods of the old faith had grown quiet. The dragon ships rested on land, their hulls silvered with frost. Yet the people of the fjords, the farms and the islands carried something eternal. Their words. Words had always been their truest wealth. They had no libraries, no printed pages, only the memory of the human voice and the marks they carved to preserve it. These marks were runes, letters and symbols that held meaning deeper than sound, believed to carry power itself. In the old tongue, run meant mystery or secret. To carve a rune was to speak to the unseen. The sagas tell that Odin himself had hung from the great tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights and 9 days, pierced by his own spear, sacrificing himself to himself, so that he might gain the wisdom of the runes. When at last he looked down and saw their shapes glimmering beneath him, he reached for them, crying out in triumph and agony. And from that moment, men learned to carve their meanings into the world. Each rune was more than a letter. It was a living thing, a small fragment of the universe. Fehu stood for wealth and cattle, Raido for the journey, Algis for protection, Ansuz for the breath of divine inspiration. Together they formed a language of power, a bridge between the human and the sacred. Even after the coming of Christianity, the runes endured. Farmers carved them into the handles of their tools for luck. Sailors marked them on the keels of their ships to keep storms at bay. Lovers scratched them into wood or bone, promising memory that would not fade. But most of all, they were carved into stone. If you walk through the valleys of Sweden or Denmark even today, you will find them. Tall, narrow stones standing by the roadside or near old churches, their surfaces etched with curling patterns and strange angular letters. They are the rune stones raised by those who wish to remember. Some are small, some grand. Some tell simple stories. Inga raised this stone in memory of Thorstein, his brother, who sailed east and found death in the land of the Russ. Others speak with pride. Tola raised this stone for her son Harold, a brave man and a good merchant. And others still in humility. Ari made this bridge for the soul of his wife. May God bless her spirit. Each one is a voice that still speaks across 1,000 years, a whisper from the living to the eternal. To the Norse, to be forgotten was the only true death. The runestones ensured that no life vanished completely. They stood where travellers could see them, where stories could be retold. When snow covered the land, when wars came and went, the stones remained. Silent witnesses of love, courage, and grief. Imagine the moment one was raised. A crowd gathers beside the road, wrapped in furs against the cold. The stone lies heavy on the ground, its surface newly carved. The smell of fresh earth and smoke fills the air. A skald begins to recite the words aloud, his voice steady and deep. The name of the departed carries on the wind, and those listening close their eyes, seeing his face once more in memory. Then, with ropes and effort, the stone is lifted upright. It stands against the grey sky, the runes catching faint light, as if the world itself has learned the art of remembrance. Runes marked not only the names of the dead, but the spirit of the living world. They were carved into tools, weapons, and amulets, symbols of blessing and defense. A sword might bear the rune Tiwaz for victory. A doorpost might hold Iwaz for strength. Every mark was both practical and sacred, a gesture of faith that the universe listened. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire glowed, poets, skalds, would sing verses woven with the rhythm of the runes. Their poetry, called Eddic and skaldic verse, was intricate and powerful, each word chosen for balance and beauty. A skald could make or break a king's fame. With his tongue, he could turn battle into legend, loss into immortality. The sagas were not written until centuries later, but they were born in these longhouses, in the flicker of firelight and the cadence of the human voice. Their words carried wisdom. Cattle die, and kinsmen die, but the fame of a good name never dies. Such lines from the Havamal still ring true, gentle reminders that courage, honour, and kindness outlast all things. And so, the Norse preserved their world not only in stone, but in song. It was this reverence for memory that allowed their stories to survive long after their gods had faded. When monks and scribes began to write them down in the 13th century, they did so in the same careful rhythm, honouring the old tradition of voice and silence. The poetic Edda, the prose Edda, the sagas of the Icelanders. Each became a vessel of remembrance, carrying the echoes of a world that refused to vanish. Through them, we can still hear the laughter of feasts, the clash of oars, the crackle of frost, the quiet prayers whispered to both Odin and Christ. These writings became bridges between ages, just as the rune stones had been bridges between the living and the dead. The Norse saw time not as a straight road, but as a circle. What was lost would return, what was done would echo. To carve a rune, to sing a poem, to tell a story, these were ways of touching eternity. Even as the Viking Age waned, the art of remembrance remained. In every home there was a storyteller. In every village, someone who could trace the line of ancestors back through generations. A child might sit at the knee of an elder and hear, "Your forefather came from across the sea. He built this farm. He fought beside the king. He planted this oak." And so the past lived on in the present, not as history, but as belonging. The sound of a chisel on stone, the rhythm of words spoken at dusk. These were not just acts of memory, but acts of love. The Vikings are often remembered for their voyages, their battles, their ships. But perhaps their truest legacy lies in this: the way they refused to let the world forget. Their runes were their voices, carved into the bones of the earth. Their poems were their souls, carried by the air. And together, they made time itself their home. If you could walk now among those stones, the ones that stand in lonely fields, the ones weathered smooth by wind and rain, you might run your fingers across the grooves and feel the pulse of something living. The letters still shimmer faintly beneath the moss. The names still breathe. 1,000 years may pass, but the lines remain. And if you listen closely, in the hush between heartbeats, you might hear what they still whisper: "Remember me." The North was a world of iron and ice, but within it, there burned a quieter fire, the strength of its women. They were the keepers of hearths and kingdoms, of wisdom and prophecy. Their names might not always fill the sagas with thunder, yet their presence shaped every shore the Viking world touched. Where men ruled the waves, women ruled the rhythm of life. In the early morning, when the frost still glazed the fields, it was often a woman who rose first, stirring the embers, lighting the fire, setting bread to bake. She was the pulse of the home, the husfreyja, the lady of the house. The word meant more than wife, it meant keeper of land, wealth, and legacy. While her husband sailed to trade or raid, she ruled the homestead in his absence, commanding servants, settling disputes, managing harvests, and guarding the family's honor. Her keys hung from her belt as a sign of authority, each one opening the chests where silver, tools, and heirlooms were kept. To lose one's keys was a shame. To wear them was to carry the trust of generations. The longhouse itself was her realm, its fires, its warmth, its daily rhythm, all bore her hand. The hearth was sacred, the center of life. Around it, children learned stories, travelers shared news, and feasts brought laughter to the dark. The woman who tended that fire was more than a caretaker. She was a protector of memory. But beyond the hearth, women's power reached further still. In the sagas, they appear as queens and poets, sorceresses and seeresses, figures of strength who guided destiny with both word and will. One of the most revered among them was the vulva, the seeress. The vulva walked between worlds. She was the keeper of ancient rites, the one who could read the threads of fate woven by the Norns. Her staff, tipped with iron or carved with runes, was both symbol and tool. Wrapped in cloaks of fur, adorned with beads and bones, she moved from settlement to settlement, called upon in times of uncertainty, harvest, childbirth, war. When she entered a home, people fell silent. She would sit upon a raised seat and begin her ritual, songs known as Seda, chants that called upon the hidden spirits. Her voice would rise and fall like the wind through the pines, rhythmic and haunting. Those who listened believed they could feel the future moving through her words. In the sagas, it is said that even kings sought the counsel of such women. Odin himself, the father of gods, was said to have learned the art of Seda from the goddess Freyja. The gift of seeing, of shaping fate, was sacred and perilous, bound more to the heart than to the sword. And though the old faith would later fade, its echoes remained in the whispered prayers of women who still felt the pulse of the land beneath their feet. Among the living, too, there were women whose power needed no prophecy, only courage, the Shieldmaidens. Legends tell of them as warriors who fought beside men, their braids whipping in the wind, shields raised high, eyes bright with fire. Their existence sits between myth and truth, yet the bones of women found in battle graves suggest that the line between the two was not so clear. Archaeologists have uncovered burial mounds where weapons lay beside female remains, swords, spears, and shields, arranged not as symbols, but as tools of war. In these graves, we see proof that at least some women of the North did indeed fight, not as exceptions, but as chosen ones, driven by honor and destiny. The sagas remember them with wonder. There was Lagertha, who fought beside Ragnar Lothbrok, her hair flowing like a banner, her blade as fierce as any man's. There was Hervor, who raised her father's ghost from his barrow to claim his sword, her courage unshaken even before the dead. There was Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red, who sailed to Vinland and faced down attackers with nothing but her fury and her will. These tales were not merely fantasies. They were reflections of a truth the Norse understood well, that strength had many forms and courage knew no gender. Yet the greatest power of Viking women was not found in war, but in wisdom. They were poets, healers, and diplomats, keepers of knowledge in a world that revered the spoken word. Many were skalds, composing verses of love, loss, and legacy. Others were healers, trained in the use of herbs and stones, midwives who brought life into a world so often ruled by death. Their remedies blended the sacred and the scientific, a poultice of moss and honey for wounds, a charm whispered over water for fever. The line between medicine and magic was thin, and both were honoured. And above all stood the queens. They ruled not by decree, but by influence, shaping the course of history with wisdom and resolve. In Denmark, Queen Thyra was called Danebod, Thyra, the adornment of Denmark. She was said to have built the Danevirke, a mighty wall of earth that protected her people from invasion. Her son, Harald Bluetooth, would later unite the realm and raise the great gelling stones in her honour. In Norway, Queen Gunhild, the mother of kings, wielded power equal to her husband's, her intellect and will commanding respect, even from enemies. And in the sagas, we find countless women who stood beside kings and warriors, their counsel as vital as any sword, their words shaping treaties, averting feuds, and guiding the course of nations. Even in love and loss, their strength endured. When men fell in battle, it was the women who kept their memory alive. They raised the rune stones, preserved their names in song, and taught their children the stories that would outlive stone and time. A Viking woman's world may have been bounded by hearth and shore, but her spirit roamed as far as any ship. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned low, women would gather to weave, not just cloth, but destiny. The loom's rhythm echoed the weaving of fate itself. Each thread, each knot, each pattern was a prayer, a hope, a memory. And as they worked, they sang, soft haunting songs that told of journeys and longing, of love that endured across oceans. Their voices rose like wind over water, blending with the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the sea outside. If you could listen to that sound now, the rustle of wool, the soft hum of melody, the heartbeat of the loom, you would hear the essence of the Viking Age, a harmony of strength and tenderness, of endurance and grace. For every ship that sailed, there was someone who waited. For every man who sought glory, there was someone who remembered. The women of the north were not shadows behind their men. They were the light that guided them home. They ruled the unseen kingdoms, the hearth, the heart, the whisper of destiny. Their legacy lives not only in sagas and stones, but in the quiet courage that shaped their world, and ours. And as the long night of history stretches onward, their stories still glow. Small, steady flames against the dark. The tide of history had turned once more. From the first quiet voyages to the founding of kingdoms across foreign shores, the Norse had changed the map of Europe. Now, in the early 11th century, they stood at their height, not as raiders or wanderers, but as kings. It was an age when the sea itself was a kingdom, and its rulers were those who could master the wind. Among them rose a man whose name would echo through 1,000 years, Nut the Great, King of Denmark, of England, and of Norway. The North Sea was his highway, and its waves his throne. But before Canut's empire, there were other figures who had begun the work of shaping unity from the storm. In Norway, Harald Fairhair had bound the scattered chieftains under one crown, his hair uncut until he achieved his dream. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth had brought his people to the new faith, blending the hammer and the cross. In Sweden, kings ruled the forests and trade routes, linking the Baltic to the rivers of the Rus. Yet it was Canute, the son of King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, who would bring all these threads together into a single northern empire, vast as the horizon. The story began with conquest. In the year 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England, a land long known to the Norse, where Danes had settled and ruled parts of the eastern coast since the days of the Danelaw. Sweyn's armies moved swiftly, and King Ethelred of England fled. For a brief moment, Sweyn ruled both Denmark and England, but his reign was short. He died the following winter, leaving his son Canute to inherit an empire not yet secure. Canute was young, untested, and surrounded by enemies. Yet within a few years, he would become one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. When Ethelred returned to England, Canute was forced to retreat to Denmark, but he did not stay defeated for long. In 1015, he returned with a fleet of hundreds of ships, their sails dark against the grey English sky. For 2 years he fought with relentless patience, his men cutting through the English defences until at last, in 1016, he took the throne. The boy who had once been exiled now wore 2 crowns, one of Denmark, one of England. His rule was not like the chaotic raids of the past. Knut was no mere conqueror. He was a statesman, a diplomat, and, in his own way, a bridge between worlds. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of the English king, binding 2 peoples with one union. He brought stability to a land weary of war, blending Danish strength with English law. In his time, the North Sea became not a border, but a highway of connection, carrying messages, goods, and faith between kingdoms. Ships laden with grain, furs, and silver sailed from London to Roskilde, from Trondheim to York. The empire was held not by walls, but by water. Knut understood something few had before him, that the power of the North lay not in dividing land, but in mastering movement. He was called Rex Totius Angliae, et Denemarchae, et Norwegiae, et Partis Sueoniae, King of all England, Denmark, Norway, and part of Sweden. And though the title was long, his reign was marked not by pride, but by balance. He ruled with a careful hand, respecting local customs and laws. In England, he confirmed the rights of the Church. In Denmark, he honoured the Thing, the Council of Freemen. He sent gifts to monasteries, built churches, and supported missionaries who carried the Christian faith deeper into the northern lands. Yet beneath the surface of peace, the old ways still shimmered. Knut was a Christian king, but he was born of pagan blood. He ruled with both mercy and might, the cross in one hand, the sword in the other. His people, too, lived in both worlds, still whispering the names of their ancient gods while kneeling in new churches of wood and stone. The chroniclers of the time spoke of him with awe. There is a story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, that he once sat upon a throne by the sea and commanded the tide to halt, to show his courtiers that even kings cannot rule the forces of nature. When the waves touched his feet, he rose and said, "Let all men know how empty is the power of kings, for none is mighty but God." Whether the tale is history or metaphor, it captures the essence of his reign. A man who understood that true power lay not in defiance, but in humility. Under Canute, trade flourished. The North Sea glimmered with sails from every shore. Coins bearing his face travelled from Dublin to Danelaw towns, from Danish harbours to the markets of the Baltic. His empire became a crossroads of culture, where Anglo-Saxon monks copied Norse sagas, and Norse craftsmen shaped crosses in silver. In his courts, languages mingled: Latin of the Church, Old Norse of the homeland, and the soft English tongue of poets. It was a time when the North seemed both eternal and reborn, and yet even the strongest tides must one day recede. When Nut died in 1035, the unity he had forged began to unravel. His sons, Harold and Harthacnut, struggled to hold what he had built. England returned to its native kings. Denmark and Norway drifted apart once more. The empire of the North Sea, brief, brilliant, and improbable, faded into memory. But its legacy endured. The age of raids was over. In its place stood a new world, one of kingdoms, trade, and shared faith. The Norse were no longer outsiders. They had become part of Europe's story. Even as Knut's empire fell, the spirit of the North remained in the towns he had touched. In York, you could still hear Norse spoken in the marketplaces. In Dublin, silver coins stamped with his likeness were traded by men whose ancestors had once raided those same shores. In Denmark, the great gelling stones still gleamed with runes that told of the old kings who had united the realm. The waves that once carried warriors now carried merchants. The swords that once took lives were melted into tools that built them. And though the ships no longer raided distant coasts, they still sailed, bringing goods, stories, and people across the same waters that had once echoed with battle cries. In many ways, Knut's empire was less a kingdom than an idea, the dream of a North without boundaries, where sea and shore were one. Even centuries later, the people of the North would remember him not just as a ruler, but as a symbol of what the Viking world had become. A civilization of strength tempered by wisdom, courage guided by grace. As Twilight settled over the 11th century, the Viking Age itself began to fade, not with defeat, but with transformation. The world was growing smaller, more connected, and the wild freedom of the old days gave way to the quiet order of kings. But in the harbours of Norway, in the meadows of Denmark, and along the cliffs of Iceland, the sound of oars still lingered, faint, rhythmic, eternal. The kings of the North Sea had ruled the waves for a generation, but their legacy was timeless. And when the wind swept over the water, carrying the scent of salt and pine, it still seemed to whisper the same old song. We were here, we sailed, we built, we dreamed. The sea remembered, it always does. There is a moment at the edge of every twilight when the light does not vanish, it simply softens. The sky holds its breath, and the world becomes still, balanced between what was and what will be. So too did the North find itself in the twilight of its gods. By the middle of the 11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to a close. The sea that had once echoed with oars now shimmered with trade ships. The longhouses that had sheltered sagas now stood beside churches of carved wood. Bells rang where once the horns of feasts had sounded. And yet, in the hush between the chimes, one could almost still hear the murmur of the old songs. The Norse had embraced the cross, but the hammer had not vanished. It lingered quietly, carved into the corners of door frames, sewn into cloaks, hidden beneath the soil of graves. Faith had changed its form, but not its heartbeat. In the sagas written during these years, the old gods began to fade, not in bitterness, but in beauty. Their stories took on the softness of farewell. Odin no longer strode across the world in disguise. Thor's thunder grew distant, rolling softly like a memory through the hills. Freya's tears for her lost lover became the morning dew, and the rainbow bridge of Bifrost shimmered only in dreams. This fading was not an ending, but a transformation. Myth becoming memory, memory becoming story. The Norse people had always known that endings were part of the cycle. Even their gods were mortal in their way. The poetic Edda, compiled long after their worship had ceased, told of this final destiny. Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. It spoke of a time when the world would grow cold, when brothers would fight brothers, when the sun would vanish and wolves would devour the moon. The sea would rise, swallowing the land, and the heavens would burn. But even in that apocalypse, the Norse saw hope. From the ashes of the old world, a new one would emerge, green and peaceful, beneath a sky reborn. 2 humans would survive, hidden in the forest to begin again. And even the gods, though fallen, would live on in memory and spirit. It was not destruction they imagined, but renewal, the turning of a wheel. Perhaps that is why the Norse accepted change so gracefully. They had lived always by the rhythm of cycles, day and night, summer and winter, voyage and homecoming. The end of their age was simply another turning of the seasons, and in those years of twilight, something remarkable happened. The myths of the old world were not lost. They were written down, preserved by those who had once worshipped them and those who now saw them as heritage. In Iceland, where the sagas were born, poets and scholars began to record what had once been spoken only by firelight. The prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, became a great vessel of preservation. A book that captured the gods before they vanished entirely into mist. Snorri, a Christian man, wrote with reverence rather than rejection. He treated Odin and Thor not as demons or false idols, but as ancestors of poetry and imagination. He understood that to forget the old stories was to forget the heart of the North itself. Through him, and through the countless anonymous poets who came before, the old gods found immortality, not in temples, but in words. It is a quiet miracle that we can still read their names today, that the echo of their world, its frost, its fire, its courage and sorrow, still hums beneath the skin of language. Even the days of the week remember them. Wednesday for Odin, Woden's Day. Thursday for Thor, Friday for Freya. Their presence hums softly through time, woven into our calendars, our tongues, our very sense of rhythm. The twilight of the gods was not their death, but their transformation into symbols. To the Norse of the 11th and 12th centuries, Christianity did not erase the past. It layered upon it. The old gods retreated into hills and mists, becoming the hidden folk, the land spirits, the huldufolk. Villagers left offerings for them long after the priests had preached against such things, whispering thanks to unseen hands that guarded home and harvest. In the valleys of Norway and the coasts of Iceland, stories persisted. Of Odin's ravens seen circling before a storm, of Thor's hammer found carved upon a stone, of elves dancing in the grass at midsummer. The new faith could baptize the body, but the land still belonged to older dreams. The churches themselves bore witness to this union of worlds. Their beams were carved with dragons and vines, their doorways shaped like the open jaws of beasts, reminders of the myths that had built the people who now prayed within. A visitor entering a stave church might have felt the mingling of ages. the scent of incense and pine, the flicker of candlelight upon carvings of serpents, the whisper of wind through wooden walls. The gods had not left, they had simply changed their language. Even the art of the skalds survived. The sagas, once sung to honor Odin, were now told in Christ's world, but they still carried the old rhythm of destiny and endurance. Heroes no longer fought for Valhalla, but their courage remained the same. Women still spoke prophecy. Kings still sought wisdom. Love and loyalty still bound hearts across the storms of fate. To live in the twilight of the old gods was to live in both past and future at once. An Icelandic farmer might bow his head in church on Sunday, then step outside to greet the sun as it rose over the mountains, murmuring an old verse that had once been a prayer to Freya for good harvest. A mother might teach her child the Lord's Prayer, then tell him by firelight the story of Thor's battle with the serpent. Faith had changed, but wonder had not. And through that wonder, the Norse spirit endured. The Viking Age had been an era of movement, of oars and storms and discovery, but its twilight was one of stillness, of reflection and storytelling, of looking back upon the path they had travelled and understanding at last what it meant. The world they left behind was not one of ashes, but of roots. Their language shaped Europe's northern tongues. Their myths inspired art and poetry for centuries to come. Their sense of courage, of endurance, of facing fate without fear, became part of the soul of the North itself. Even now, when the northern lights ripple across the winter sky, it is easy to imagine that they are the armour of the Valkyries still riding the heavens. When thunder rolls across the mountains, it feels like Thor's laughter, echoing faintly through the clouds. The twilight of the gods did not extinguish the fire. It softened it into embers, glowing beneath the snow, waiting for those who still remember to look closely. In the villages of Scandinavia, people began to build new rhythms of life. Kingdoms grew stable, trade routes blossomed, monasteries became centres of learning. Yet in every story they wrote, in every law they crafted, the old ways left their fingerprints. The courage of the sagas became the backbone of northern literature. The honesty and equality of the thing became the seed of modern democracy. The deep reverence for nature, the wind, the sea, the land spirits, never vanished. It remained the quiet religion of those who still walked the forests and sailed the fjords. The North had learned to live between worlds, pagan and Christian, mythic and real, ancient and new. As night falls on this age of twilight, imagine a small farmhouse by the sea. Inside, a family gathers around a fire. The father reads from a Christian psalter. The mother hums a song whose melody is older than both their faiths. Outside, the aurora shimmers above the waves. A child, watching from the doorway, whispers a question. Do the old gods still watch us? The parents smile. Perhaps, they say. In the wind, in the stars, they still listen. And somewhere, far above the world of men, the last echo of Odin's ravens circles once more. Not in defiance, but in peace. The twilight of the gods was never an ending. It was the soft merging of story into eternity. The sea never forgets. Even when the great ships rest on land and the oars lie silent, the tides still murmur the songs of those who once crossed their surface. The waves remember the rhythm of wood and will, the weight of dreams cast across their back. By the 12th century, The Viking Age had ended in name, but not in spirit. The dragon ships were no longer the terror of foreign shores. They had become symbols of memory, resting beneath the northern sky like great sleeping beasts. Yet from time to time, a sail still rose against the horizon, white and proud, catching the same winds that had once carried whole generations toward the unknown. These were the last voyages, journeys of trade, pilgrimage, and remembrance, led by those who still felt the call of the open water deep in their blood. Across Iceland, Greenland, and the narrow channels of the North Sea, ships still moved like slow shadows, their prows gliding through cold mist. The Norsemen of these later centuries were no longer raiders or conquerors. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. But the sea remained their constant companion, their second home. In Iceland, longhouses stood beside new stone churches, their smoke rising together into the pale sky. Life had settled into rhythm, haymaking in summer, storytelling in winter. Yet, in the dark months, when the northern lights shimmered and the world felt close to the divine, people still spoke of the old voyages, of Eric the Red, of Leif Erikson, of lands far beyond the edge of maps. And some could not resist their pull. Even after Christianity had rooted itself in every fjord and village, curiosity endured. That restless flame that had first drawn their ancestors to sea. Young men would still stand on the cliffs at dawn, watching the waves break against the rocks, imagining what lay beyond. They had read the sagas, sung the songs, touched the rune stones. The stories were too alive to fade. So they built ships, fewer now but no less beautiful. The long, sleek lines of oak, the iron nails dark with pitch, the sails woven from wool. Some were built for trade, carrying furs, ivory, and fish to the markets of England and Norway. Others, more rarely, were built for pilgrimage, journeys to holy sites across Europe, from Trondheim to Rome, even to Jerusalem. The same hands that had once carved dragon heads now carved crosses. But the feeling was the same, the thrill of setting out upon the endless, unpredictable water. In Greenland, the descendants of Eric the Red kept their farms alive against impossible odds. Their settlements clung to the fjords like candlelight in the dark. Summers were brief and golden, winters long and cruel. Each year they waited for ships from Iceland, for news, for tools, for wine and grain. Some years the ships came, some years they did not. Still, they endured, generation after generation. They built churches of stone, their bells echoing faintly across the ice. They raised their children to read both the Psalms and the sagas. And sometimes, on still nights, they would look west across the empty sea and wonder about the stories their ancestors told, of Vinland, the green and distant land. Did anyone ever return there in secret? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But it is comforting to think that one or two small ships might have slipped from Greenland's shores, following the gulls into the fog, not seeking riches or conquest, only remembrance. Those who sailed at the end of the Viking Age were not explorers of empire, but of the heart. They sought to keep alive the connection between their people and the sea, to prove, even quietly, that the horizon was still within reach. Some voyages led southward, to the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, where Norse blood had already mixed with Celtic hearts. There, the memory of the North lived on in song and surname, in the carved stones of old chapels, in the rhythm of language itself. The Norse Gaels, as they came to be called, were bridges between two worlds, sailors and poets, warriors and monks, descendants of both storm and peace. Others turned east toward the Baltic, where trade still flowed through the old river routes of the Rus. The great Varangian markets of Novgorod and Kiev had changed, but echoes of the northern tongue remained. The Norse had left behind not just goods, but ways of thinking, words for law, for honour, for home. Everywhere they had once sailed, small pieces of their spirit remained, woven into the fabric of other cultures. The last voyages were not loud or legendary. They were gentle, a generation's soft farewell to the sea. In Norway, the great ship burials ceased, replaced by churchyards and crosses. Yet the shape of the ships lingered in their art and architecture. Even the old wooden churches, the stave churches, carried the curves of a longship in their beams, as though the builders could not help but craft their faith in the language of sails and waves. To walk into one was to walk into a ship bound for heaven. Inside, the air smelled of pine and candle wax. Light filtered through narrow windows, falling upon carvings of dragons and vines. A priest's voice rose in Latin, but above him the rafters still whispered of the sea. It is said that even long after the raids had ceased, the English and the Franks could still recognize the Norse ships from afar. They were no longer feared, they were admired, their craftsmanship unmatched, their sails graceful against the horizon. The ships themselves had become works of devotion, symbols of beauty and freedom. And so the spirit of voyage did not die. It evolved. The Norse gave birth to generations of sailors who would one day guide Europe into its own age of exploration. The same methods of navigation, the same sense of wonder, the same courage to follow stars into the unknown. All were born in these cold, northern waters. Perhaps the truest last voyage was not one of wood and sea, but of memory. The sagas, written now on vellum and parchment, became their own kind of ships, carrying the stories of the old world into the new. Each tale was a vessel of time, each word an oarstroke across the centuries. When the scribes wrote of Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland, or of Greta the Strong's lonely exile, or of Gudrid, the woman who crossed oceans and bore a child in the New World, they were preserving not just history, but spirit. And through those words, the Vikings sailed once more, across the quiet waters of time, into every generation that would read and remember. By the 13th century, the last settlements in Greenland had grown silent. The sea froze earlier each year. Trade ships ceased to come. One by one, the farms were abandoned, their roofs collapsing under snow. But when later travellers arrived, they found traces. A silver cross here, a spindle whirl there, the outline of a hearth where warmth had once glowed. Even at the edge of the world, the Norse had left signs of life. It is tempting to see these final moments as endings. But the people of the North never thought of time that way. They believed in cycles, the setting sun that rises again, the sea that retreats and returns. The last voyages were not goodbyes. They were continuations, ripples in water that never truly stills. And so, when you stand on a northern shore today, when the wind stings your face and the horizon gleams with pale fire, you are standing in the echo of those who once watched the same sea with the same wonder. The ships may have gone, but the sea remembers their shape. The world they built, of courage, curiosity, and connection, still drifts within us, unseen but eternal. For the Vikings, the ocean was never something to conquer. It was a mirror, reflecting who they were and who they longed to be. And in that reflection, they found their truest home. The last voyages were never about distance. They were about belonging to the sea, to the story, to the endless song of the North. When an age ends, it does not disappear. It lingers in story, in song, in the quiet corners of the mind where memory hums like an old tune. And so it was with the Viking Age. Long after the last sails had vanished from the horizon and the longships rested beneath moss and soil, their stories remained. In the twilight of the north, among fjords and windswept plains, people began to tell again the tales that had shaped them, not as history, but as legend. This was the time of the weaving. In the long winter nights, when the snow whispered against the walls and the aurora flickered like breath across the sky, families gathered by the fire. The flames painted their faces with gold and shadow. The old songs returned, stories of gods, of voyages, of love and loss. But now, the storytellers were no longer the warriors and sailors of the Viking world. They were their children, their grandchildren, men and women who lived in the calm after the storm, who looked back with both pride and wonder. They spoke of heroes who walked between worlds, of gods who had once strode across mountains, of kings whose names had outlived their crowns. And in their telling, the lines between truth and myth blurred, as softly and inevitably as the blending of dusk into night. The sagas that emerged from this era were not written by conquerors, but by rememberers. In Iceland, where the fire of storytelling burned brightest, monks and poets began to write down what had once been spoken. They used quills instead of oars, ink instead of sails, but their craft was the same: to carry something precious across the sea of time. They wrote of gods and men, of courage and tragedy. They wrote of creation and ending, of loyalty and fate. And through their hands, the voices of the past found new life. The poetic Edda, a collection of ancient verse, became the beating heart of Norse memory. It told of the beginning of the world, when fire and ice met and the first giant Ymir was born. It told of Odin's wisdom, of Thor's might, of Loki's cunning and sorrow. The prose Edda, written later by Snorri Sturluson, explained these myths for a new age, a bridge between pagan memory and Christian understanding. Snorri called his work a circle of wisdom, a phrase that perfectly captured what the North had always known, that the end of one story is simply the beginning of another. The sagas, too, became vessels of memory, not of gods, but of people. They told of explorers and kings, lovers and poets, outlaws and dreamers. Each saga was a world unto itself, a living map of emotion and fate. There was Egil's saga, about a poet-warrior whose temper was as fierce as his verse. Laxdæla saga, about generations of love and revenge. Gisli's saga, Njal's saga, the saga of the Volsungs. Through them, we glimpse not only battles and voyages, but hearts, moments of tenderness, humour, grief, and through their pages, the Viking world breathed again. In these stories, women stood beside men as equals of courage and wisdom. The gods were flawed and human. The heroes were mortal but magnificent. The sagas did not worship perfection. They honoured endurance, the courage to face fate without fear. It is this humanity that has kept them alive for centuries. When later generations read the sagas, they found not strangers, but reflections of themselves, people who dreamed, loved, and lost beneath the same sky. And so the Viking Age, though gone, became eternal, not as a time of war, but as a song of life. Outside the halls where these stories were told, the world was changing. Europe had entered the Middle Ages. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, and kings ruled from courts of silk and steel. Yet in the north, the voice of the sagas remained strong, simple, patient, and unbroken. They were not written for glory or power. They were written to remember. And because of that, they endured where empires fell. When the great kingdoms of the south quarreled and faded, the stories of the north still whispered beneath the wind, carried in the language of poets, in the rhythm of waves, in the hearts of those who listened. The legends of the Vikings travelled far beyond their homeland. In England, their names became part of place and word, towns ending in by, Thorpe, Wick, remnants of the Norse tongue carved into the land itself. In France, the descendants of Viking settlers would become the Normans, whose leader William would cross the Channel in 1066 and forever change the history of England, another echo of the Sea King's ambition. In Russia, the legacy of the Rus lingered in names, in trade, in memory. And in Iceland, the poets kept weaving. By the 13th century, long after the last dragon ship had sailed, the island had become a nation of storytellers. Every home held a memory of the sagas. Every child grew up hearing the names of ancestors who had sailed to Greenland, or fought beside kings, or seen the northern lights from lonely cliffs. Even today their words remain, unbroken for 1,000 years. The weaving of legend is more than preservation. It is transformation. When people remember together, they reshape the past into meaning. The Norse did not remember their gods and heroes with sadness, but with peace. They understood that everything, even glory, must one day soften into story. In that sense, the sagas were acts of love. Each word was a thread, each name a knot. Together, they formed a tapestry that stretched across centuries, a woven song of sea and snow, of bravery and belonging. If you listen closely, you can still feel that tapestry humming beneath our own stories today. The courage of the sagas lives in every tale of adventure. Their sense of fate and freedom echoes in every story of journey and self-discovery. Their reverence for nature lingers in every quiet awe before the mountains and stars. The Old North never truly faded. It simply changed its shape, from ships to words, from gods to symbols, from history to dream. Imagine a winter night, long after the Age of Kings. A single longhouse stands beneath the aurora. Inside, a family gathers close to the fire. The old grandmother sits in a carved chair, her hands folded in her lap. The children lean forward, eyes bright in the golden light. She begins to speak. Her voice is slow, rhythmic, like the rocking of a ship. She tells of Odin's ravens, of Thor's hammer, of a hero who sailed beyond the edge of the world. The words drift through the room like snowflakes, soft and timeless. When she finishes, the children are silent for a moment. Then one whispers, "Were they real?" The grandmother smiles. "They were," she says, "in the way that everything remembered is real." And the fire crackles, and the aurora glows, and the story lives on. This is how the Viking Age endures, not as conquest or empire, but as story. It is how the North keeps its heart beating, how the sea keeps its voice alive. For legends are not ghosts, they are living things, woven into every human longing for courage, for freedom, for the endless horizon. And so the people of the North, who once measured their worth by the distance they could sail, found their truest voyage in the one that never ends, the voyage of memory. The weaving of legend was their greatest creation. Through it, they built a world that cannot die. The night has grown long, and the sea lies quiet. The winds that once carried dragon ships across oceans now whisper only through pine and snow. The world that once thundered with oars and song has fallen still, not dead, but dreaming. This is the sleep of the North. The Viking Age, with all its fire and frost, has passed into legend. Yet the land remembers, the sea remembers, and somewhere, deep in the silence of winter, the echoes of that age still breathe, soft as the sigh of waves against stone. If you stand on a northern shore at dusk, you can still feel it. The chill air on your skin, the cry of a gull over the darkening water, the faint scent of salt and pine, the same sky, the same stars, the same eternal rhythm. The waves roll in and out, just as they did 1,000 years ago, washing the edges of the world smooth with time. Beneath them lie the bones of ships, the anchors of voyages long past. The tide touches them gently now, not as conqueror, but as friend. Each crest and fall of the water is a heartbeat of memory. Each gust of wind carries a fragment of story. You can almost hear it if you listen. The low hum of oars dipping in rhythm, the call of voices across fog, the deep, steady breath of a people who once followed the horizon wherever it led. They are gone, and yet they are here. In the language, in the stories, in the very shape of the coasts they named. In the quiet after an age, life goes on. The farms that once raised warriors now raise poets. The ships that once carried raiders now carry fish and grain. The same hands that once forged swords now craft songs. The fire that once burned for conquest now burns for warmth. The people of the North have learned to live with peace as their inheritance, to build upon the bones of history without forgetting its heartbeat. And so the Viking world, though gone, remains woven through the fabric of the present like gold thread in a cloak, glimpsed only when the light catches just right. Its echoes are subtle, but they endure. You can hear them in the laughter of children in Reykjavik, tracing the stories of Odin and Thor in schoolbooks older than their grandparents. You can hear them in the creak of fishing boats leaving the harbours of Lofoten at dawn. You can hear them in the ancient hymns of the stave churches, where candlelight still flickers upon carvings of dragons and vines. Even the modern ships that glide across the same waters are descendants of those longships, faster, mightier, yet built with the same reverence for the sea. Every time a sailor lifts his eyes to the horizon, every time a traveller stands at the edge of a cliff and feels the pull of distance, the Viking spirit stirs, quiet, eternal, unforgotten. The sagas sleep too, but lightly. They rest in libraries and memory, in the rhythm of modern speech, in the poetry of the North. The Havamal, the saga of the Volsungs, Njal's saga, the prose Edda, all still whisper through the centuries, like the sound of embers in a hearth. Their words, written in ink but born of voice, still remind us what the Vikings always knew, that life is fleeting, courage is sacred, and memory is stronger than death. Those who wrote them did not know they were shaping immortality. They simply sought to remember, and in doing so, made time their companion. Sometimes, when snow falls thick and soft over the fjords, It feels as though the whole land is holding its breath, listening for something. Perhaps the creak of a longship in the harbour. Perhaps the echo of a horn calling from a distant shore. But no sound comes. Only the steady rhythm of the wind, the hush of snow, the slow heartbeat of the earth. And yet, that silence is not emptiness. It is peace. The north no longer needs to shout. It remembers quietly now, through the shimmer of aurora, through the whisper of rivers under ice, through the names etched into every stone and stream. If you were to wander through Scandinavia today, you would still find them, the traces of the age that sleeps. A runestone standing in a meadow, its letters softened by moss. A fragment of a sword in a museum, its steel dark with age. A carved prow of a ship, its dragon eyes still fierce beneath centuries of dust. A handful of amber beads, once worn by a woman who sang her children to sleep beneath the same stars you see tonight. Each one is a fragment of memory, small but eternal. And perhaps this is the truest legacy of the Viking world. Not the battles, not the empires, but the endurance of wonder. The Vikings lived knowing that all things end, that ships rot, that kings fall, that even the gods must sleep. But they also believed that nothing beautiful is ever truly lost. It becomes part of the great cycle, woven back into the world. The sea that carried them still carries us. The stars that guided them still shine above us. The stories they told still warm our nights. Imagine the north now, in its winter quiet. A small village beside a fjord. The houses glow with warm light beneath a sky of green fire. Inside one home, a child sits by the hearth, listening as a voice, perhaps a mother's, perhaps a grandfather's, tells the old stories once more. The words are soft, timeless. The names drift through the air like snowflakes. Odin, Freya, Thor, Eric, Gudrid, Leif. The child listens, eyes heavy with sleep. And in that moment, in that tender passing of story from one generation to the next, the Viking Age lives again. Not as history, not as myth, but as love. The same love that built ships and sagas, that crossed oceans and carried memory through the storms of time. The North has always known how to rest. Its people learned to find beauty in stillness, in the hush of snow, in the glow of fire, in the way twilight lingers forever at the edge of day. And so the Viking Age sleeps not in silence, but in harmony. Its breath the wind, its dreams the stars, its heartbeat the slow, eternal rhythm of the sea. If you close your eyes, you might still feel it. The weight of a wooden deck beneath your feet, the sway of waves against the hull, the cry of gulls somewhere beyond the mist. A ship waits, patient, timeless. Its sails catch the wind. The journey never truly ended. It only changed its form. The Vikings have not vanished. They have simply gone home, into the sea, into the sky, into the stories that will never fade. The sleep of the North is deep, but it is not the sleep of forgetting. It is the rest of a long voyage well done. And perhaps, one day, when the world grows still again, when humanity pauses long enough to listen, we will hear that familiar rhythm rising once more. The sound of oars in water, the whisper of wind through sail, the voice of the past calling softly across the waves. We are still here. We have only gone to rest. So now let the sea grow quiet. Let the stars drift slowly overhead. Let the old songs fade into the hush of sleep. The age has ended, but its dream remains. The north rests beneath its blanket of snow, the sky watching gently above. Close your eyes. Breathe deep. The stories will keep watch tonight. For the north, in all its ages, has never truly slept. It only dreams.